Picture a Sunday morning in Kearns, Utah, not 50 years ago. Right now, the parking lots that once overflowed with minivans and families in their Sunday best are half empty. The building is still there. The sign still reads, "The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints." But the people who used to fill every row, every week, for 4 decades, they are not there. Some moved, some got older, and some just quietly stopped coming and never came back. The church will not tell you about that parking lot. What the church will tell you is that 2024 was a year of tremendous global growth. New stakes organized in Zimbabwe, a new mission in Madagascar, temples announced in countries that didn't have one last year. At every general conference, the message is consistent and triumphant. The work of God is accelerating. The kingdom is expanding. The numbers are moving in the right direction. But there is another set of numbers that never appear in a conference talk. Numbers that no general authority brings to the pulpit. And those numbers tell a completely different story about what is happening not in Africa or the Philippines, but right here in the state that was supposed to be the eternal proof that this church works. In 2024, 9 stakes in Utah were quietly dissolved. The year before, 7. 16 stakes in 24 months, more than half of every stake ever discontinued in Utah in this entire century, gone in just 2 years. And in February of 2026, observers who track LDS administrative data watched something happen that has no modern precedent. 6 stakes in Murray, Utah, an entire city's worth of church infrastructure, reorganized simultaneously, 6 at once. No announcement, no explanation, no press release. When a new stake is created, a general authority flies in from Salt Lake City. There are tears, testimonies, photographs. The church news covers it. It is treated as a miracle made administrative. When a stake dissolves, there is silence. That silence is what this documentary is about. To understand why this silence is so loud, you need to understand what a stake actually represents. It is not just an administrative unit, a box on an org chart. By the church's own theology, a stake is a declaration of permanence. You cannot fake one. To organize a stake in the United States, you need a minimum of 5 functioning wards, at least 3,000 members on the rolls, and, this is the critical part, a minimum of 99 active tithe-paying Melchizedek priesthood holders. Real men, showing up every week, putting money in the envelope. When a stake disappears, it is because that critical mass no longer exists. The people are gone, and in a church that runs entirely on lay participation, gone people are the one thing you cannot spin. So let's talk about where they went. In December 2025, Religion News Service published the results of the most comprehensive analysis of LDS retention data ever compiled. Researchers Jana Reese and Benjamin Knoll, names that Latter-day Saint institutional leaders know very well and have reason to fear, presented their findings. The headline was simple and devastating. In 2007, the LDS Church retained 70% of the people raised in it. By 2023 and 2024, that number had fallen to 54%. Nearly half of everyone raised in this church is now leaving it. And critically, it is not the older generations driving that collapse. It is the young. Among millennials and Generation Z, the General Social Survey found that 55% of those raised Latter-day Saint no longer identify as such. More than half. In a single generation. Now here is what makes that number so significant in the context of Utah specifically. For decades, the church reported that approximately 60% of Utah's population were members of the faith. 60%. That was the proof of concept. That was the evidence that living the gospel produced a society, a culture, a way of life strong enough to hold a majority of an entire state. When researcher Ryan Cragen published his independent survey in the Journal of Religion and Demography, he found that only 42% of Utah adults now self-identify as members. And when Pew Research conducted their own survey in 2024, they found 50%, down from 55% a decade earlier. Both numbers point in the same direction. The church's self-described homeland is no longer majority Mormon by any honest measure. Utah has crossed a threshold it will not uncross, and the leaders know it. Here is the detail that should make every current member stop and think very carefully about what they are being told from the pulpit. In October 2025, at General Conference, just months before the Murray Stakes reorganization, senior church leaders publicly dismissed the idea that young people are leaving in unprecedented numbers. One apostle called it a narrative, not a trend, not a challenge to address. A narrative, a story being told by people who, in the implication, have an agenda. Then, 3 weeks later, the data came out. The peer-reviewed, nationally representative, methodologically rigorous data. And it said, no, this is not a narrative. 55% of Millennial and Gen Z Latter-day Saints are gone. This is the most severe generational retention crisis in the history of this church. And the men at the top of the institution had just stood at the most watched pulpit in Mormonism and told the membership it was a story people were making up. That gap, between what the data shows and what the leadership says, is the central question of this documentary. What does it feel like to be inside that gap? Think about a family in Kearns. Parents who were baptized in that building, married in the temple, raised 4 children inside the same ward boundaries. The father served as elders' quorum president. The mother ran the Relief Society. 2 of the 4 children served missions. And then, slowly, quietly, one conversation at a time, things changed. The oldest daughter went to college and started asking questions nobody had good answers for. The second son came home from his mission different, hollowed out in a way that took years to name. He eventually came out as gay. The church's position on that question is not ambiguous. The family had to make choices no family should have to make. And the stake that had held all of them, that had been the architecture of their entire social world, no longer had enough people to function. That is not an abstraction. That is what stake dissolution actually looks like up close. The research on why people leave is now detailed enough to stop being speculative. Reese and Knoll's data, published in January 2025, found that sexual orientation is one of the single most predictive factors in disaffiliation. 80% of people who left the church identified as heterosexual. But the gap between leavers and loyalists on LGBTQ identity is enormous. The church's hard line, no same-sex marriage, gender defined strictly as biological sex at birth, celibacy or conformity as the only options, is driving a disproportionate share of departures among the young. And those who leave are not leaving quietly. They are leaving loudly, and they are telling their friends. Education is the other major driver. The more education a Latter-day Saint receives, the more likely they are to leave. That correlation is consistent across every data set researchers have examined. In a state where the information age has made every uncomfortable piece of LDS history, the polygamy, the historical accuracy disputes, the race and priesthood timeline, the financial opacity, instantly accessible to any curious teenager with a phone, the idea that education is pushing people out should be alarming to institutional leaders. It is, instead, something they have responded to by doubling down on the insular structure of church education, and by repeatedly warning members against trusting sources outside the institution. That strategy is not working. Meanwhile, the church is building. 24 operating temples in Utah as of early 2026, with more under construction. The temple in Taylorsville, the temple in Haber Valley, the temple in Toole. Hundreds of millions of dollars of stone and steel rising against the Wasatch Mountains, declaring permanence to a landscape that is quietly, measurably becoming less Mormon every year. Critics of the institution, and there are now enough former members to constitute their own substantial community, have started asking whether the temple building pace in Utah is an act of institutional faith or institutional denial. Whether the church is investing in the future it expects, or the future it wishes would still be coming. The church has a carefully prepared counter-argument to everything in this documentary. The Deseret News, which the church owns, published their own analysis in December 2025, noting that while retention has declined, Latter-day Saints still retain members at a higher rate than most other major Christian denominations. That is technically true. The active core of Latter-day Saint membership is genuinely devoted. Weekly attendance, daily scripture reading, and reported spiritual experience remain among the highest of any faith group in America. The church is not in freefall. The people who stay are staying hard. But the relevant question is not how devoted the people who stay are. The relevant question is what happens to an institution when the pool it draws from keeps shrinking. When nearly half of every child raised in the faith walks out the door before reaching 30. When the state that was supposed to be the living proof of the gospel's social power is now 34% religiously unaffiliated, higher than the national average. When working-class neighborhoods that sustain 6 stakes for 40 years can barely sustain 2. The relevant question is what the trajectory means, not what the current snapshot shows. And that is the question the leadership will not engage with directly. because engaging with it honestly would require admitting something that contradicts the central narrative of a church that believes it is the only true and living church on the face of the whole earth. It would require acknowledging that something is going wrong not at the margins, but at the core, not in distant mission fields, but in the home zip codes, not among strangers, but among the children of the most dedicated members they have. D. Todd Christofferson is a thoughtful, educated man. He holds a law degree from Duke University. He has served in the Quorum of the 12 Apostles since 2008. He speaks with precision and intellectual clarity. When he addresses the membership on questions of doubt and disaffiliation, he does so with pastoral warmth and a genuine belief in what he is saying. None of this is theater for him. The faith is real. But faith does not make the numbers move. And the numbers, in Utah, are moving in a direction that no General Conference address has yet been willing to name clearly. 16 stakes dissolved in 2 years. 6 reorganized simultaneously in a single city in February 2026. 55% of Millennial and Gen Z members gone. 42 to 50% Mormon self-identification in a state the church officially claims is 60% member. 13 full-time missions assigned to a state with less than 1% of the national population, because Salt Lake City, without calling it that, started treating its own homeland as a mission field. And at every General Conference, new stakes in Africa, new temples on every continent. The work is accelerating. The kingdom is expanding. The numbers are moving in the right direction. There is a parking lot in Kearns, Utah, half empty on a Sunday morning. The building is still there. The sign still reads the right name. But something has changed that cannot be unchanged. And the silence from Salt Lake City about that change, the careful language, the optimistic framing, the apostle calling a documented statistical collapse a mere narrative, is not a communication strategy. It is a tell. It is the sound of an institution that knows exactly what is happening and has decided, at least for now, that the membership does not need to be told. Maybe you disagree. Maybe you think the active core is enough. Maybe you think the global growth offsets the domestic erosion. Maybe you think the trajectory will reverse when the culture shifts back. Leave that argument in the comments, because it is worth having. What is not worth having is the pretense that there is nothing to argue about. The stakes are collapsing. The data is public. The silence from leadership is deafening. And now you know.